Winter, 1691. Salem Village, Massachusetts Bay Colony. 600 souls, pressed against the edge of a wilderness they believed was watching them. The cold came early that year. It settled into the wooden houses like something alive, something patient. In the meeting house, Reverend Samuel Parris preached about the devil with a voice that made children press closer to their mothers. In the taverns, men who had been neighbors for 20 years no longer met each other's eyes. In the frozen lanes between properties, boundary disputes festered like infected wounds. Something was breaking in Salem Village. You could feel it in the silences that fell when certain names were mentioned. You could see it in the way families sat on opposite sides of the meeting house, the building divided like a living thing split down the middle. The Putnams, the Porters, the nurses, the Quarries, names that should have meant community now meant faction, rivalry, barely suppressed rage. The court records are dry. They speak of land disputes, unpaid debts, arguments over the minister's salary. But read between the lines and you find something more visceral. A community cannibalizing itself. A place where resentment had become the architecture of daily life. Where every interaction was a potential betrayal. No one knew it yet, but Salem Village was kindling. Dry, brittle, waiting for a spark. In January of 1692, a 9-year-old girl provided it. Her name was Elizabeth Parris, 9 years old, daughter of the village minister Samuel Parris, a man whose sermons dripped with apocalyptic terror. The records describe her symptoms with clinical coldness, odd postures, foolish, ridiculous speeches, distemper. But read between the lines and you find something more disturbing. Betty Parris was screaming. Not the scream of pain. The scream of something else. Witnesses said she crawled under furniture, that she threw objects, that she spoke in voices that were not her own. Her cousin Abigail Williams, 11 years old, soon exhibited the same behaviors. Then Ann Putnam Jr., 12. Then more. The village physician William Griggs examined them and found no physical cause. His diagnosis, recorded in a deposition, is 4 words long. The evil hand is upon them. The evil hand. Not illness, not trauma. Not the psychological collapse of children living in a community soaked in fear and fury. Evil, external, demonic. And if the devil was in Salem Village, then someone had invited him in. The hunt for witches began not with evidence, but with the assumption that evidence must exist. That someone, somewhere, was guilty. And once that assumption took root, it grew like frost across glass, beautiful, intricate, and utterly distorting. The first accusations came in late February. The afflicted girls, under pressure from magistrates and ministers, were asked to name their tormentors. They named 3 women. Tituba, an enslaved woman from Barbados who lived in the Parris household. Sarah Good, a homeless beggar despised by the village. Sarah Osborne, an elderly woman who had scandalized Salem by living with a man before marrying him and who had not attended church in over a year. 3 women already outside the circle of respectability. 3 women with no power, no advocates, no social currency to spend in their own defense. The pattern would repeat throughout the trials. The first to be accused were always the ones least able to fight back. The marginalized, the strange, the resented. But here is what the records also show. The accusations did not stop with the outcasts. Within weeks, the girls would name church members, landowners, even a former minister. The contagion of accusations spread upward through the social hierarchy, and Salem's leaders began to realize too late that they had unleashed something they could not control. In the Danvers Archival Center, you can still read the arrest warrants. The ink is brown now, oxidized by 3 centuries, but the language is sharp as a blade. You are commanded to apprehend the body of Tituba Indian, Sarah Good, and Sarah Osborne and bring them before us. The body, not the person. The body. The examinations took place in the Salem Village Meeting House, a bare structure with hard benches and cold light. The accused were brought in shackled. The afflicted girls sat in the front rows, a chorus of suffering, and the magistrates, John Hathorne and Jonathan Corwin, presided with a certainty that seems, in retrospect, like madness. The transcripts of these examinations are not trials. They are performances of predetermined guilt. Hathorne's questions were not questions at all, but accusations phrased as inquiries. Why do you hurt these children? Not did you, but why? The assumption of guilt embedded in the grammar. When Sarah Good was examined on March 1st, she denied everything. But the girls began to scream and contort. They claimed they could see her specter, her spiritual form, tormenting them even as her physical body stood before the court. Spectral evidence, the testimony of visions. How do you defend yourself against a vision? How do you prove that your soul did not leave your body to commit invisible crimes? Sarah Good was asked if she believed in God. She replied, "Yes, I do." But her voice, the record notes, was sullen. Sullen became evidence. Anger at false accusation became proof of demonic possession. The trap was perfect. Of the 3 women examined that day, only Tituba confessed, and her confession changed everything. She spoke for hours. She described meeting the devil, a tall man in black who came to her in Boston and demanded she serve him. She described a book he carried, in which she signed her name. She described flying through the night with Sarah Good and Sarah Osborne, tormenting children, attending witches' sabbaths. She named other witches, women she said she had seen in the devil's company. Was any of it true? The question is almost irrelevant. What matters is that Tituba understood the rules of the game faster than anyone else. Denial meant death. Confession meant survival. The Puritans believed that true confession brought repentance, and repentance brought salvation. A confessed witch could be saved. A defiant witch was already lost. But Tituba's confession did something more dangerous. It validated the entire premise of the witch hunt. If one woman confessed to consorting with the devil, then the devil was real, witchcraft was real, and the other accused must also be guilty. Her words, extracted under interrogation in a language not her own, became the foundation for everything that followed. She would spend 13 months in prison. She would never be tried. And she would survive. By late March, the jail in Salem was filling. More accusations, more arrests. The afflicted girls had discovered that their words carried power. The power to command attention, to inspire fear, to destroy lives, and they used it. Some historians argue the girls were manipulated by adults with grudges. Others suggest mass hysteria, ergot poisoning, psychological trauma. But the records suggest something more unsettling, that the girls, for a brief and terrible moment, held absolute authority in a society that normally granted them none. They were children, they were female, they were powerless, until they started screaming. Then men listened. The accusations began to follow the fault lines of village politics. The Putnam family, locked in a bitter land dispute with the Porter family, found that the afflicted Ann Putnam Jr., surprise, accused members of the Porter faction. Rebecca Nurse, a 71-year-old matriarch beloved in her community, was accused by the Putnams. The witch hunt was becoming a weapon. On March 21st, Rebecca Nurse was arrested. Her examination was packed. People could not believe that this woman, pious, elderly, hard of hearing, could be a witch. 39 of her neighbors signed a petition testifying to her Christian character, but the girls screamed. They fell. They claimed her specter was choking them. And Haythorne, watching them writhe, asked Rebecca Nurse, "What do you say to this?" She said, "I am as innocent as the child unborn." The colonial government, watching Salem descend into chaos, established a special court to handle the witchcraft cases. The Court of Oyer and Terminer, to hear and to determine. 9 judges led by Lieutenant Governor William Stoughton, a man whose theological certainty was absolute, and whose mercy was non-existent. The court convened on June 2, 1692. Its first case was Bridget Bishop, a woman who ran a tavern, wore a red bodice, and had been accused of witchcraft years earlier. She was everything Puritan society distrusted: flamboyant, independent, unapologetic. The evidence against her was spectral testimony and the word of men who claimed she had bewitched them. She was convicted in one day, hanged on June 10th, the first execution. When Bridget Bishop's body was cut down from Gallows Hill, something should have changed. Someone should have said, "This has gone too far." But instead, the machinery of the court ground forward. More trials, more convictions. The logic was inescapable. If you stopped believing in the witches, you had to admit that you had murdered innocent people. So you kept believing. The summer of 1692 would see 19 people hanged, 1 man pressed to death under stones, at least 5 more dead in prison. And the court, the ministers, the magistrates, they all told themselves they were doing God's work. Cotton Mather was 30 years old in 1692, a prodigy, a scholar, a minister of enormous influence. He had written extensively about witchcraft, about the devil's war on New England. His book, Memorable Providences Relating to Witchcrafts and Possessions, had primed the Puritan imagination for exactly this kind of crisis. And when the trials began, Mather watched with fascination and horror. He never attended the trials in person. But he wrote about them. He corresponded with judges. He urged caution about spectral evidence. Visions alone, he argued, should not be enough to convict. But he also insisted that witches were real, that the devil was real, that the trials were necessary. His position was a paradox. Be careful, but keep hunting. In his diary, Mather recorded his prayers for the afflicted. He fasted, he wept, he believed genuinely that he was witnessing a cosmic battle. And perhaps he was right. Not a battle between God and the devil, but a battle between fear and reason, between power and innocence, between the need to believe in simple evil and the terror of confronting human cruelty. Mather's influence kept the trials alive. His sermons from the pulpit of Boston's North Church gave them legitimacy. And when, years later, he was asked about his role, he would say he had done his best. That he had tried to temper the excesses. That history would judge him kindly. History has not. The jails were not built for this. Salem's prison was a cellar, damp and dark, where the accused were kept in chains. Boston's prison was larger, but no less brutal. Prisoners had to pay for their own food, their own shackles. If they could not pay, they starved or remained chained even after acquittal. Children were imprisoned. Sarah Good's 4-year-old daughter, Dorcas, was accused of witchcraft and spent months in chains. The psychological damage was permanent. A deposition describes her as never well afterward, her mind broken by what had been done to her. The accused waited in these holes for weeks, sometimes months, before trial. Some died before they could be hanged. Sarah Osborne, one of the first accused, died in prison on May 10th. The records list her death without comment, as if it were inevitable, as if she had already been forgotten. In the darkness of those cells, what did they think? What did they say to each other? Some confessed to avoid execution. Others maintained their innocence and went to the gallows. There was no right answer. Confession saved you, but damned your soul. Denial saved your soul, but killed your body. The choice between damnation and death is not a choice at all. It is torture. June 10th, Bridget Bishop. July 19th, 5 more. Sarah Good, Rebecca Nurse, Susanna Martin, Elizabeth Howe, Sarah Wilds. They were taken to Gallows Hill in a cart, the road rough and rutted. Crowds followed. Some jeered, some wept. The hangings were public. They were meant to be. Rebecca Nurse's execution haunted witnesses for years. She was excommunicated from the church the night before her death, struck from the rolls, her soul officially damned. On the gallows she prayed. Nicholas Noyes, the minister who presided, told her to confess. She refused. After she was dead, someone carved her name into the tree from which she had been hanged. The tree is gone now, but the name remained for decades, a scar in the wood. Sarah Good was last to hang that day. Standing on the ladder, noose around her neck, she turned to Nicholas Noyes and said, "You are a liar. I am no more a witch than you are a wizard, and if you take away my life, God will give you blood to drink." Legend says that 25 years later, Nicholas Noyes died of a sudden hemorrhage, choking on his own blood. The legend is true. The legal crisis at the heart of the trials was spectral evidence, the testimony that an accused witch's invisible spirit had committed crimes. The afflicted girls would scream that they saw the specter of Martha Corey or John Proctor tormenting them. The specter was invisible to everyone else, but the court accepted it as proof. This created an impossible situation. How do you defend yourself against something no one else can see? How do you prove that your spirit did not leave your body? The accused tried everything. They recited the Lord's Prayer. Witches, it was believed, could not do so without error. They displayed physical disabilities to prove they could not have performed the actions described. None of it mattered. Even judges began to question the logic. If the devil could assume the shape of an innocent person to commit crimes, then spectral evidence proved nothing. But William Stoughton, the chief judge, had an answer. God would not allow the devil to impersonate the innocent. Therefore, if you were accused, you must be guilty. This reasoning was a theological snake eating its own tail. It turned accusation into proof, vision into evidence, fear into fact. and it meant that once you were named, you were already condemned. The dissent came too late, and it came too quietly. By August, the accusations had spread beyond Salem Village. Martha Carrier of Andover was arrested and called a rampant hag by Cotton Mather. George Burroughs, a former minister with enemies, was accused of being the witches' ringleader. John Proctor, a farmer who had publicly criticized the trials, found himself arrested along with his wife. The pattern was clear. Speak against the trials and you became a target. Question the girls and they accused you. The fear was total. Silence became survival, and in that silence, the machinery of execution continued. George Burroughs' trial was a spectacle. He was educated, articulate, able to defend himself. On the stand, he recited the Lord's Prayer perfectly, something witches supposedly could not do. The crowd murmured. Doubt flickered. But the girls began to scream, and Cotton Mather, watching from the crowd, stood and delivered a speech reminding everyone that the devil could disguise himself as an angel of light. Burroughs was convicted. At his execution on August 19th, he recited the Lord's Prayer again, standing on the ladder with the noose around his neck. The crowd was moved. Some began to question. But the hangman did his work. Burroughs' body was shoved into a shallow grave, his face left exposed, his mouth and nose filled with dirt. The message was clear. Even eloquence, even piety, even prayer could not save you. Giles Corey was 80 years old, a farmer, irascible, tough. When his wife Martha was accused, he testified against her, something he later recanted, consumed with guilt. Then he himself was accused, but Giles Corey refused to enter a plea. Without a plea, there could be no trial. Without a trial, his property could not be seized by the government. He was protecting his son's inheritance. The penalty for refusing to plead was peine forte et dure, pressing. The accused was laid on the ground, a board placed on his chest and stones piled on top until he either entered a plea or died. On September 19, 1692, Giles Corey was taken to a field beside the jail. He was stripped, laid on the ground, and the pressing began. Witnesses said it took 2 days, that he screamed, that his tongue protruded from his mouth and the sheriff pushed it back in with his cane, that each time he was asked to plead, he said only 2 words. More weight, add more stones, kill me faster, I will not give you what you want. He died on the 2nd day, his ribs shattered, his lungs collapsed. He never entered a plea. His sons inherited his land. And Salem had its first martyr, a man who chose torture over submission. The site of his death is unmarked. But if you know where to look, if you walk the fields near the old jail site, you can still feel it. The weight of what was done there. Who were the afflicted girls? History has flattened them into a single entity, the girls. But they were individuals with names, families, motives. Ann Putnam Jr. was 12, the daughter of a powerful family with grievances. Mercy Lewis was a servant who had survived an Indian attack that killed her parents. Mary Walcott was 16, eager to please. Abigail Williams was 11 and lived in a house where her uncle preached hellfire daily. Some historians argue they were victims of abuse, trauma, patriarchal oppression. Others argue they were calculating manipulators. The truth is probably both. They were children in a world that gave them no power until they started screaming. And then, suddenly, they could destroy lives with a word. But read their depositions closely. Read the trial transcripts. There are moments where you can see the performance cracking. Times when the girls glanced at each other before answering. Times when their symptoms, so synchronized, seemed rehearsed. The court noticed. But the court did not care. In one examination, a magistrate asked why the girls' fits only occurred in the presence of the accused. The girls had no answer. The question was not pursued. After the trials ended, the afflicted girls scattered into history. Ann Putnam Jr. would later issue a public apology blaming the devil for deceiving her. The others never spoke of it again. But you have to wonder, in the quiet of their later lives, alone with their thoughts, did they remember? Did they see the faces of those they had condemned? Did they dream of Gallows Hill? Not everyone believed. There were dissenting voices, quiet, careful, terrified of becoming targets themselves. Thomas Brattle, a Boston merchant, wrote a letter in October 1692 that circulated privately among the educated elite. He dismantled the trial's logic piece by piece. Spectral evidence was worthless, the afflicted girls were frauds, the confessions were extracted through terror. But Brattle did not publish his letter. He did not stand in court and denounce the proceedings. He wrote in secret and hoped someone with power would listen. Increase Mather, Cotton's father and president of Harvard, also expressed doubts. In a sermon in October, he said, "It were better that 10 suspected witches should escape than that one innocent person should be condemned." But by then, 19 people were already dead. The skeptics had courage, but they did not have enough courage. They whispered when they should have shouted, and their silence was complicity. In the archives, you can find Brattle's letter preserved in acid-free folders, the ink still legible. It is a devastating document, and it is a monument to moral failure, to the knowledge that something was wrong and the choice to stay safe rather than speak. History does not forgive cowardice, even when cowardice is understandable. September 22, 1692. The final mass execution. 8 people hanged together, their bodies swinging from a single beam. Martha Corey, Mary Easty, Ann Pudeator, Alice Parker, Mary Parker, Wilmot Redd, Margaret Scott, Samuel Wardwell. Mary Easty had written a petition from prison, one of the most powerful documents of the trials. She did not ask for her own life. She knew she was already condemned. But she begged the judges to examine the evidence more carefully, to stop the executions, to prevent more innocent blood from being shed. "I petition to your honors not for my own life," she wrote, "for I know I must die. But if it be possible that no more innocent blood be shed." They hanged her anyway. The crowd at this execution was different, quieter. Doubt had begun to seep in. Too many respectable people on the gallows. Too many whose only crime was being disliked by the wrong person. The applause and jeering were gone. There was only the creak of rope and the sound of bodies kicking air. After the executions, the bodies were cut down and buried in shallow graves near the gallows. No coffins, no markers. Their families were forbidden to retrieve them. But legend says that under cover of night, some families came anyway, dug up their dead, and carried them home for proper burial. The graves at Gallows Hill are still there, unmarked and forgotten, somewhere under the parking lots and residential streets of modern Salem. The dead are still waiting. In October, the afflicted girls accused Lady Mary Phipps, wife of the colonial governor. It was a catastrophic miscalculation. You could accuse beggars, farmers, even ministers. But the governor's wife? That was a bridge too far. Governor William Phipps had been away in Maine fighting in King William's War. When he returned and learned his wife had been accused, he acted swiftly. He dissolved the court of Oyer and Terminer. He forbade further arrests based on spectral evidence. The machinery stopped, but it did not stop because of justice. It stopped because power had been threatened. As long as the trials consumed the powerless, they were allowed to continue. The moment they reached upward toward the elite, they were ended. This is the ugly truth at the center of the Salem witch trials. They were never about witchcraft. They were about power. About who could be destroyed and who could not. About which lives mattered and which could be discarded. When Lady Phipps was accused, the trials revealed themselves for what they always were, a weapon. And weapons that threaten their wielders are put away. In January 1693, a new court was established to try the remaining accused. The Superior Court of Judicature, with different rules. Spectral evidence was no longer admissible. Confessions obtained under duress were suspect. The standard of proof was raised. Of the 52 people tried under the new court, 49 were acquitted. 3 were convicted, but Governor Phipps immediately pardoned them. The witch hunt was over, but the damage was done. 150 people had been imprisoned, families had been destroyed, property had been seized, the social fabric of Salem Village was shredded. And 19 people were dead, along with at least 5 who died in prison, and Giles Corey pressed beneath stones. The survivors staggered out of the jails, blinking in the winter light. Some found their homes had been looted. Some found their reputations destroyed beyond repair. Philip English and his wife had escaped to New York during the trials. They returned to find their estate ruined, their fortune gone. They would die in poverty. The court had stopped, but the consequences would echo for generations. In the months after the trials, Salem went quiet. No one wanted to talk about what had happened. The judges issued no apologies. The afflicted girls were not questioned. The ministers did not recant. There was only a collective, suffocating silence. The silence of people who know they have done something unforgivable and hope that silence will absolve them. But some could not stay silent. Samuel Parris, the minister whose household had birthed the accusations, tried to defend his role. He preached sermons claiming he had acted in good faith, that he had been deceived by the devil. His congregation would not forgive him. In 1697, after years of bitter conflict, he was forced to resign and leave Salem. Cotton Mather never admitted error. He wrote more books, more sermons, more justifications. He insisted the trials had been necessary, that real witches had been executed, that only minor procedural errors had occurred. He would spend the rest of his life defending what happened in 1692, his reputation slowly corroding under the weight of his own words. But others broke. Samuel Sewall, one of the judges, stood in his church in 1697 and asked to be publicly forgiven. He handed a written confession to his minister, who read it aloud. Samuel Sewall desires to take the blame and shame of it, asking pardon of men and especially desiring prayers that God would pardon that sin. It was the only judicial apology, the only admission of guilt from anyone in power, and it came 5 years too late. In 1706, 14 years after the trials, Ann Putnam Jr. stood before her church and asked to be received back into full communion. She had been one of the primary accusers, responsible for the deaths of at least a dozen people. Now, 26 years old, she made a public statement. It was not quite an apology. It was an explanation. She claimed she had been deluded by Satan and that she had acted ignorantly and unwittingly. She said she desired to lie in the dust and earnestly beg forgiveness of God and from all those unto whom I have given just cause of sorrow. But she did not name names. She did not say, I lied about Rebecca Nurse, or I destroyed Martha Corey. She spoke in abstractions, as if the deaths had been an unfortunate accident, rather than the result of her testimony. The church accepted her confession. She was readmitted. She lived the rest of her life in Salem Village, and died at 37, unmarried, without children. The historical record does not tell us what she thought in the years between her confession and her death. Whether she was haunted, whether she felt remorse or simply relief that she had survived. But we know this, she never recanted. She never said it had been a lie, only that she had been deceived. Which leaves the question, was she a victim or a perpetrator? A traumatized child or a calculating killer? The answer is yes. For over 200 years, the bodies of the executed remained in unmarked graves near Gallows Hill. Their families were forbidden to retrieve them, though some did in secret. The rest were left to rot in shallow pits, their names forgotten, their graves lost. In the 1950s, researchers began trying to locate Gallows Hill. The historical record was vague, somewhere on the outskirts of Salem, near a rocky outcrop. But the landscape had changed. Roads, houses, shopping centers had been built. The hill itself had been quarried and reshaped. In 2016, after years of research using historical maps, eyewitness accounts, and ground-penetrating radar, a team finally identified the execution site, a small, rocky ledge behind a Walgreens parking lot. There is a memorial there now, a modest plaque. But no bodies were ever recovered. The graves are still lost. Stand there on a cold morning with the cars pulling in and out of the parking lot and try to imagine it. The crowd, the cart carrying the condemned, the noose, the bodies swinging in the wind. And then centuries later, a pharmacy and a Dunkin' Donuts and the relentless mundanity of American commerce built on top of it all. The dead are still there, under the asphalt, under the foundations, still waiting. The trials destroyed Salem economically. 150 people had been imprisoned. Their property had been seized or looted. Their families had been forced to pay for their incarceration, food, shackles, even the cost of execution. Some were bankrupted. Philip and Mary English, wealthy merchants, fled to New York during the trials. When they returned, they found their estate had been plundered by Sheriff George Corwin, who had enriched himself by seizing property from the accused. English sued. The case dragged on for years. Corwin died before it was resolved, and English, in an act of cold revenge, seized Corwin's body and held it hostage until the estate paid him restitution. The body of the man who had hanged witches was held for ransom by a man he had tried to destroy. It is a perfect encapsulation of what Salem had become, a community where every relationship was poisoned, every transaction tainted, every neighbor a potential enemy. The village never recovered. The meeting house split into factions. Families moved away. By the mid-18th century, Salem Village had renamed itself Danvers, trying to shed the shame of its past. But the name change was cosmetic. The trauma remained. Of the 20 people executed, 14 were women. Of the 150 imprisoned, roughly 2/3 were women. This was not coincidence. This was pattern. Witchcraft accusations in early modern Europe and America targeted women at vastly disproportionate rates, and not just any women. Widows. Women who lived alone. Women who were outspoken. Women who had property. Women who did not conform to Puritan expectations of female submission and piety. Bridget Bishop wore a red bodice and ran a tavern. Martha Carrier was described as having a slanderous tongue. Rebecca Nurse was old and deaf and had contradicted a man in church. Sarah Good was homeless and begged for charity. These were women who had in one way or another stepped outside their prescribed roles. The witch hunts were a mechanism of social control, a way to punish women who did not obey, who spoke too loudly, who wanted too much. And the afflicted girls, who wielded the power of accusation, were themselves victims of this system, trapped in a world where their only power came from destroying other women. This is the horror beneath the horror. The witch trials were not an aberration. They were an expression of a society that fundamentally did not trust women, did not value women, and was willing to kill women to maintain control. What drives a person to accuse another of witchcraft? Fear, certainly. Self-preservation. But also something darker, the pleasure of power. Read the depositions of the afflicted girls and you find a disturbing pattern. They did not just accuse, they performed. They screamed at precise moments. They fell at strategic times. They gave detailed, vivid descriptions of spectral attacks that matched each other's testimonies with suspicious precision. This was not random hysteria. This was orchestrated. Whether consciously or unconsciously, the girls had learned that their suffering gave them authority, that their fits could command a room, that their words could destroy lives. And some of them, perhaps not all, but some, enjoyed it. There is a psychological term for this: factitious disorder imposed on self, or in extreme cases, on others. The creation or exaggeration of symptoms to gain attention, sympathy, power. It does not mean the girls were not suffering. Trauma and manipulation can coexist. But it does mean that their suffering was weaponized. And the adults, the magistrates, the ministers, the parents, they enabled it. They gave the girls a stage and an audience and a script, and then they acted surprised when the play turned into a bloodbath. Dorcas Good was 4 years old when she was arrested. Her mother, Sarah Good, had been accused of witchcraft, and the afflicted girls claimed that little Dorcas's specter was biting and pinching them. A 4-year-old witch, she was kept in prison for 8 months, in chains, the heavy iron cut into her wrists and ankles. She was barely fed. She watched her mother taken away to be hanged. When Dorcas was finally released, the jailer demanded payment for her imprisonment. Her father had to sell everything to pay the debt. Dorcas lived into adulthood, but she was never the same. Her father later testified that she was insane, that the trauma of her imprisonment had broken her mind permanently. She was 4 years old. Other children were imprisoned. Dorothy Good, 9 years old. Betty Hubbard, 17. The Puritan worldview had no concept of childhood innocence as we understand it. Children were born in sin, capable of evil, accountable to God. If a 4-year-old could sin, she could also be a witch. This is what ideology does. It overrides instinct. It makes the unthinkable seem logical. It turns a prison cell for a toddler into an act of righteousness. The ministers of Massachusetts faced a crisis. They had preached that the devil was real, that he sought to destroy New England, that vigilance against sin was essential, and when the trials began, their sermons seemed prophetic. Here was the devil, exposed and defeated. But as the executions mounted, some ministers began to worry. Increase Mather, the most respected theologian in the colony, was troubled by spectral evidence. He wrote Cases of Conscience Concerning Evil Spirits, arguing that the devil could impersonate the innocent and that visions alone were not proof. But the book was published in October 1692, after most of the executions had already occurred. And Mather undermined his own argument by including a preface signed by 14 other ministers, affirming that the trials had been necessary and just. Cotton Mather went further. He wrote The Wonders of the Invisible World, a defense of the trials that detailed the evidence against the accused and praised the judges for their righteousness. It was published with the endorsement of Governor Phipps. It was a propaganda document designed to justify what had been done. But the book backfired. Readers found the evidence unconvincing, the logic circular, the certainty chilling. And as the years passed, The Wonders of the Invisible World became not a defense but an accusation, proof of how far the ministers had been willing to go to avoid admitting they were wrong. Robert Califf was a Boston merchant who had watched the trials with horror. In 1700, he published More Wonders of the Invisible World, a scathing rebuttal to Cotton Mather's defense. Califf compiled testimony, letters, trial transcripts, and his own blistering commentary, exposing the trials as a fraud and Mather as a fanatic. Mather was furious. He called Califf a liar, a slanderer, a tool of the devil. He tried to have the book suppressed. When that failed, he arranged for a copy to be publicly burned in the yard of Harvard College. But the book survived. It circulated, and it changed the narrative. For the first time, the victims of the trials had a voice. Their testimonies, their last words, their pleas for mercy were recorded and preserved. And the judges, the ministers, the accusers were named and shamed. Califf's book is brutal. It does not forgive. It does not soften the edges. It calls the trials what they were, murder, and it holds the powerful accountable, which is why it terrified them. In the archives, you can still find copies of More Wonders of the Invisible World, the pages brittle and brown. It is a difficult book to read, not because the prose is dense, but because the content is unbearable. But it is necessary, because without it, the official story would have stood unchallenged. And the official story was a lie. Scratch the surface of the Salem witch trials and you find land disputes. The Putnam family versus the Porter family. Disputes over property lines, inheritance, control of the village church. And the accusations followed these disputes with eerie precision. The Putnams supported Samuel Parris as minister. The Porters opposed him. Ann Putnam Jr., the primary accuser, named multiple members of the Porter faction. Rebecca Nurse, a Putnam enemy, was accused. George Jacobs, who had land disputes with the Putnams, was accused. This does not mean witchcraft accusations were only about land, but land was the fuel. Personal grudges were the spark. And the trials were the fire that consumed everything. Paul Boyer and Stephen Nissenbaum's landmark study, Salem Possessed, mapped the accusations onto a map of property disputes and found an almost perfect correlation. The trials were a proxy war, fought not with lawyers but with nooses. This is the banality of evil, not dramatic, not supernatural, not even particularly interesting. Just property lines and petty grievances, and human beings willing to kill for a few acres of farmland. Tituba disappeared from the historical record after her confession. She spent 13 months in prison and was never tried. In April 1693, she was sold to a new owner to pay her jail fees. After that, nothing. We do not know if she lived or died, where she went, what she thought of what her words had unleashed. She was enslaved, a woman of color in a violently racist society, and her story was not considered worth recording. But her confession, coerced, strategic, utterly devastating, shaped the entire course of the trials. She gave the magistrates what they wanted, proof that witches existed, that the devil was in Salem, that the accusations were real, and by confessing, she survived while others died. Was she a victim or a collaborator? The question is almost meaningless. She was enslaved. She had no autonomy, no power, no choice. She did what she had to do to live. And the people who used her confession to justify executions, they were the ones with power, the ones with choice. But history has been unkind to Tituba. She has been portrayed as sinister, as the instigator, as the one who brought dark magic to Salem. This is racism dressed as history. Tituba was not the villain. She was the scapegoat, and when her usefulness ended, she was erased. What did they say, standing on the gallows? The condemned were sometimes allowed to speak. Some prayed, some proclaimed their innocence, some cursed their accusers. George Burroughs recited the Lord's Prayer perfectly, and the crowd wavered. Sarah Good cursed Nicholas Noyes and predicted his death. Martha Corey said, "You are a gospel witch," to the minister who condemned her. But some said nothing, or their words were not recorded. They were hanged and buried and forgotten, their voices silenced forever. This is what haunts, not the deaths themselves, but the erasure. The way power can not only kill but also control the story afterward, decide who is remembered and how, whose words are preserved and whose are lost. The trial transcripts are full of voices, mostly the voices of accusers, magistrates, judges. The accused speak in fragments, their words filtered through the hostile pen of the court recorder. But sometimes in the margins, you find something raw, a denial, a plea, a prayer. And you realize these were real people, not characters in a morality play. Real people who stood on a scaffold and felt the rope and knew they were about to die for something they did not do. And there was nothing they could say to stop it. The Puritan worldview was built on certainty. Certainty of sin. Certainty of salvation or damnation. Certainty that God's will was knowable and that deviation from it was evil. This certainty made the witch trials possible. But what if the ministers had been taught to doubt? What if Puritan theology had valued humility over certainty, questions over answers, mercy over judgment? The trial records show moments where doubt flickered, magistrates who hesitated, jurors who asked for more evidence, ministers who privately questioned spectral testimony. But the culture of certainty crushed these doubts. To doubt was to betray God. To question was to invite the devil in. This is the danger of absolute conviction. Not that it leads to evil, evil exists with or without it, but that it makes evil easy. It removes the friction, the hesitation, the human instinct to say, wait, this doesn't feel right. The Salem witch trials did not happen because Puritans were uniquely wicked. They happened because Puritans were uniquely certain. And certainty, when weaponized, is indistinguishable from cruelty. In 1992, 300 years after the trials, Salem dedicated a memorial to the victims. It is a quiet place, a courtyard surrounded by stone walls. On the walls are inscribed the names of the 20 executed: Bridget Bishop, George Burroughs, Martha Carrier, Martha Corey, Mary Eastie, Sarah Good, Elizabeth Howe, George Jacobs Sr., Susanna Martin, Rebecca Nurse, Alice Parker, Mary Parker, John Proctor, Ann Pudiator, Wilmot Redd, Margaret Scott, Samuel Wardwell, Sarah Wilds, John Willard, Giles Corey. The names are carved in stone, permanent, but also incomplete. The memorial does not include the 5 who died in prison. It does not include the shattered lives, the broken families, the trauma that echoed through generations. Memorials are necessary, but they are also insufficient. They mark where suffering occurred, but they do not undo it. They say we remember, but they cannot say we will prevent this from happening again. Because it has happened again. The mechanisms of the Salem witch trials, fear, accusation, spectral evidence, the presumption of guilt, have reappeared throughout history. The Red Scare, the Satanic Panic, modern moral panics. The tools change, but the pattern remains. Stand at the Salem Memorial and read the names. And then ask yourself, whose names are being carved now? Whose accusations are we believing without evidence? Who is standing on a scaffold because we were too certain of our own righteousness? The Salem witch trials created a perverse incentive: confess and live, deny and die. This produced a wave of false confessions, people admitting to impossible crimes to save their lives. Tituba confessed to flying and meeting the devil. Dorcas Good, a 4-year-old, confessed to having a snake familiar. Margaret Jacobs confessed, then recanted, saying she had lied to avoid execution and had condemned innocent people, including her own grandfather, George Jacobs Sr., who was hanged. The magistrates accepted these confessions as proof that the trials were working. They did not ask why every confessed witch survived, while every defiant accused person died. They did not question the obvious pattern, because the confessions validated their worldview, and validation was more important than truth. This is how false confessions work. Apply enough pressure, torture, isolation, fear, exhaustion, and people will confess to anything. They will name names. They will invent details. They will destroy themselves and others just to make the pain stop. Modern interrogation techniques are built on this same logic, and modern juries, like the Puritan magistrates, trust confessions because they cannot imagine why someone would confess to something they did not do. But Salem should have taught us, confession does not equal truth. It equals survival. In 1976, a scientist named Linda Caporel proposed a theory. The afflicted girls had been poisoned by ergot, a fungal parasite that grows on rye and causes convulsions, hallucinations, and psychosis. The theory gained traction. It offered a scientific explanation, a way to understand the trials without implicating human cruelty. But the ergot theory has serious problems. Ergot poisoning affects entire communities, not just a handful of girls. It causes gangrene and death, symptoms not present in the afflicted. And most damningly, the girls' fits stopped and started at strategic moments, during examinations in the presence of the accused, which does not match the random symptoms of poisoning. The ergot theory is comforting. It says, this was an accident, a tragedy, but not a crime. But the evidence suggests otherwise. The afflicted girls were performing. The magistrates were complicit. The trials were not a mistake. They were a choice. We want to believe that atrocities require extraordinary explanations: fungus, demonic possession, mass psychosis. But the truth is simpler and more damning. Ordinary people, given power and validation, will do monstrous things. No ergot required. The Salem witch trials ended in 1693, but their legacy did not. The fear they embodied, fear of the outsider, fear of women, fear of the uncontrollable, has reappeared again and again in American history. In the 1950s, Senator Joseph McCarthy accused hundreds of Americans of being secret communists based on little or no evidence. Careers were destroyed. Lives were ruined. The parallels to Salem were so obvious that playwright Arthur Miller wrote The Crucible, explicitly linking the two events. In the 1980s and 1990s, the Satanic Panic swept the country. Daycare workers were accused of ritual abuse based on the coerced testimony of children. Dozens were convicted and imprisoned. Many convictions were later overturned when the accusations proved to be false. In every case, the pattern is the same: a moral panic, accusations without evidence, the presumption of guilt, the silencing of dissent. And in every case, the victims are the marginalized, the weird, the foreign, the poor, the ones without power to defend themselves. Salem was not unique. It was a blueprint. The descendants of the Salem witch trials live with a complicated inheritance. Some are descended from the accused, Rebecca Nurse's family, the Proctors, the Coreys. Others are descended from the accusers, the Putnams, the magistrates, the judges. In the 20th century, some descendants formed reconciliation groups attempting to heal the historical wounds. In 2001, Putnam and Nurse descendants met in a public ceremony and apologized to one another. It was symbolic, heartfelt, and ultimately inadequate. How do you apologize for judicial murder? How do you reconcile with ghosts? But the effort matters. Not because it undoes the past, but because it acknowledges it. Because it says, this happened, our ancestors did this, and we will not pretend otherwise. There are still descendants who refuse to talk about it, who are ashamed of their connection to the trials, who have changed their names, moved away, tried to bury the history. And there are descendants who have embraced it, who have become historians and activists, who have dedicated their lives to making sure the story is told. Both responses are understandable. Both are human. But only one is necessary. Modern Salem is a tourist destination. Every October, the city swells with visitors looking for witches, haunted houses, ghost tours. There are witch shops, witch museums, witch-themed restaurants. The tragedy of 1692 has been commodified, sanitized, turned into entertainment. This is deeply uncomfortable. People died here. They were tortured, hanged, crushed. And now their suffering is a brand. But it is also complicated. The tourism industry funds the memorials, the museums, the historical preservation. Without it, the story might be forgotten entirely. And some of the tours, some of the museums, do tell the truth. They honor the victims, they educate. The question is, can you remember atrocity and profit from it at the same time? Can you turn suffering into spectacle without dishonoring the dead? Maybe, if you are careful, if you are respectful, if you center the victims rather than the spectacle. But Salem does not always do that. Sometimes it feels like a theme park built on a graveyard. Walk through Salem in October, surrounded by people in witch costumes buying trinkets, and you feel the disconnect. The real witches, the ones who died, are nowhere in sight. They have been replaced by fantasies, cartoons, stereotypes. The dead deserve better. In 1957, Massachusetts formally apologized for the Salem witch trials. In 2001, the state exonerated 5 of the accused who had been left out of earlier resolutions. But even now, not all of the victims have been officially cleared. Some were never tried, and so were never convicted, meaning there is nothing to exonerate. Others remain in a legal gray area, their names still technically tainted by accusations that were never formally resolved. This legal pedantry is an insult. Every person accused in the Salem witch trials was innocent. There were no witches. There was no devil's conspiracy. There was only fear, lies, and judicial murder. But the law requires specificity. It requires proof. It requires process. And so, more than 3 centuries later, some of the dead are still waiting for justice. It is absurd, it is bureaucratic, and it is a reminder that institutions move slowly, reluctantly, only when pressured. That official acknowledgement of wrongdoing is always incomplete, always delayed, always insufficient. But it also matters, because names have power, and until every name is cleared, the work is not done. What is a witch? In 1692, a witch was a person who had made a pact with the devil. Today, a witch is anyone accused of threatening the social order, a woman who does not conform, a person with unpopular beliefs, a scapegoat. The word has changed, but the function has not. We still use witch hunt as a metaphor for baseless persecution. We still hunt for witches, we just call them something else. Terrorists, pedophiles, communists, immigrants. Whoever the culture has decided is the enemy, the outsider, the threat. And we still use the same tools. Accusation, fear, spectral evidence. We still say where there's smoke, there's fire. We still punish the accused before guilt is proven. Salem should have taught us that this logic is deadly. That accusation is not proof. That fear is not justice. But we have not learned. We keep hunting witches because it is easier than confronting the real problems: poverty, inequality, trauma, systemic cruelty. A witch is a distraction, a villain we can blame so we do not have to blame ourselves. The Salem witch trials are over, but the documents remain. The arrest warrants, the depositions, the trial transcripts, the death warrants. They are kept in climate-controlled archives in Massachusetts, handled with gloves, digitized for preservation. To read them is to enter a ghost world. The handwriting is archaic, the language formal and strange, but the emotions are immediate. You can feel the terror of the accused, the certainty of the magistrates, the cruelty of the accusers. In one deposition, Rebecca Nurse says, "I am innocent and clear, and have not one drop of witchcraft in me." In another, George Burroughs from prison writes a letter to his children, telling them to trust in God. In another, Margaret Jacobs recants her confession and begs forgiveness for the lies she told. These documents are evidence, not just of what happened, but of who suffered. They are voices from the grave, demanding to be heard. And they are fragile. The paper is disintegrating. The ink is fading. Archivists work to preserve them, but eventually, even with the best care, the originals will crumble. We will be left with digital copies, scans, facsimiles, which means the time to listen is now, before the voices fade entirely. To understand the Salem witch trials, you must understand Puritan theology. Puritans believed the devil was real, active, and at war with God's chosen people. They believed New England was a city on a hill, a holy experiment, and that the devil sought to destroy it. They also believed in providence, that nothing happened by accident. Illness, crop failure, infant death, all were signs of God's displeasure or the devil's work. And if the devil was working through witches, then witches must be found and destroyed. This worldview made the trials inevitable. Not because Puritans were stupid or gullible, but because their theology demanded it. If you believe the devil is real and active, then witchcraft is not superstition. It is a rational response to observable phenomena. The Enlightenment would eventually replace this theology with empiricism, with science, with skepticism. But in 1692, the Enlightenment had not yet reached Salem. They were living in a medieval mindset, and medieval minds burned witches. We look back and see madness. They looked around and saw evidence of God's plan. Both perspectives are true. And that is the tragedy. Not everyone died. Many of the accused survived, by confessing, by fleeing, by luck. But survival was not freedom. They returned to a community that had tried to kill them. They lived with neighbors who had testified against them. They rebuilt lives from ruins. Elizabeth Proctor survived because she was pregnant when convicted. Executions of pregnant women were delayed until after birth. By the time she gave birth, the trials had ended. She was pardoned, released, and returned home to find her husband John hanged, her property seized, her reputation destroyed. She remarried. She survived. Philip and Mary English fled to New York and returned to find themselves bankrupted. They spent the rest of their lives suing for restitution. They never recovered their wealth. Tituba was sold to pay her jail fees and disappeared from history. The survivors carried the trauma for the rest of their lives, and they passed it down. Descendants of the Salem witch trials report that the story was told in their families for generations, sometimes with pride, sometimes with shame, always with pain. Trauma does not end when the crisis ends. It echoes. Of the 9 judges on the court of Oyer and Terminer, only one ever apologized. Samuel Sewall stood in his church in 1697 and asked for forgiveness. The others said nothing. William Stoughton, the chief judge, went on to serve as lieutenant governor and acting governor of Massachusetts. He never expressed regret. When asked about the trials, he reportedly said, "We were in the right. If I were to do it again, I would do it the same way." John Haythorne, the most aggressive interrogator, never apologized. He went on to a successful political career. His great-great-grandson, Nathaniel Hawthorne, would later add a W.co. to the family name in an attempt to distance himself from his ancestors' crimes. The silence of the judges is its own kind of evidence. It tells us that they did not see the trials as a mistake. They saw them as necessary. And that certainty, that refusal to doubt, is what allowed the trials to happen in the first place. Power does not apologize. Power justifies. They were not witches. There were no witches. There was no devil's conspiracy, no Sabbaths, no pacts, no flying, no spectral torture. It was all a lie. But the lie had power. It shaped reality. It killed people. And in a strange way, it created witches, not through magic, but through accusation. You became a witch the moment someone said you were. This is the power of language, of narrative, of social construction. Labels create reality. Call someone a witch often enough with enough authority, and they become one, not in fact, but in consequence. The accusation brings the punishment, and the punishment validates the accusation. The women hanged on Gallows Hill were not witches, but they died as witches. Their names were recorded as witches. Their graves were unmarked because they were witches. The label stuck, even though the crime was imaginary. It took 300 years for Massachusetts to officially say, there were no witches. And even now, in the popular imagination, Salem is the place where witches were, not where innocent people were murdered, where witches were. Language is a weapon, and it outlasts the bodies. The Salem witch trials cost the colony approximately £600 in court costs, jail fees, and executions. The real cost, in lives, in trauma, in communal trust, is incalculable. But there is another cost, the cost of certainty itself. The Puritan magistrates were certain the devil was at work, certain the afflicted girls were telling the truth, certain that spectral evidence was reliable, and that certainty made them monsters. Doubt would have saved lives. Humility would have prevented executions. A willingness to say, I don't know, would have changed everything. But doubt was seen as weakness. Uncertainty was seen as faithlessness. And so they proceeded with absolute confidence into absolute horror. This is the lesson. Certainty kills, not always literally, but always eventually. Because certainty does not require evidence, it does not tolerate dissent, it does not correct itself. It simply consumes everything in its path and calls it righteous. The antidote to Salem is not more religion or less religion, more law or less law. It is doubt. It is the willingness to say, I might be wrong. It is the humility to stop before the killing starts. But humility is hard, and certainty feels so good. People say Salem is haunted. They mean ghosts. But the real haunting is not spectral. It is historical. The past is not past. It is here, in the memorials, in the archives, in the descendants who still carry the names of the accused and the accusers, in the legal precedents set by the trials, in the way we still hunt witches, still believe accusations without evidence, still choose certainty over doubt. Salem is haunted by its own history, and America is haunted by Salem. Every time we see a moral panic, we see Salem. Every time we believe an accusation without proof, we see Salem. Every time we punish the outsider, the strange, the unpopular, we see Salem. The haunting is not metaphorical, It is structural. It is built into how we think, how we judge, how we decide who belongs and who does not. And until we confront that, until we excavate the logic of the witch hunt and dismantle it piece by piece, we will keep being haunted. The ghosts are not in the graveyard, they are in the mirror. The Salem witch trials have inspired centuries of literature. Nathaniel Hawthorne's The House of the Seven Gables, Arthur Miller's The Crucible, Maurice Condé's I Tituba, Black Witch of Salem. Each generation retells the story, finding in it new metaphors, new warnings, new meaning. Miller used Salem to critique McCarthyism. Condé used it to explore racism and colonialism. Hawthorne used it to wrestle with his ancestors' guilt. The trials are a mirror. We see in them what we need to see. But the danger is that the story becomes so metaphorical, so symbolic, that we forget it was real. Real people died. Real children were imprisoned. Real families were destroyed. The literature is necessary. It keeps the story alive. But it also risks sanitizing it, turning suffering into art, tragedy into entertainment. Read the plays, the novels, the poems, but also read the trial transcripts, read the depositions, read the death warrants. Let the voices of the real victims, unfiltered, unromanticized, haunt you, because that is what they deserve. Not to be characters, to be remembered as they were, human, terrified, and innocent. Some of the afflicted girls lived into old age. Ann Putnam Jr. apologized, but Abigail Williams, Mercy Lewis, Mary Walcott, they never did. They married, had children, lived long lives, and never publicly acknowledged what they had done. Did they regret it? Did they remember? Did they lie awake at night and see the faces of the people they had condemned? We do not know. They left no diaries, no confessions, no letters expressing remorse. They simply lived their lives and took their secrets to the grave. This silence is infuriating. We want accountability. We want the guilty to suffer, to repent, to at least admit what they did. But history does not give us that satisfaction. Most of the people responsible for Salem died without ever acknowledging their role. And this too is a lesson. Justice is rare. Accountability is rarer. Most atrocities end not with apologies but with silence. The perpetrators move on. The survivors are left to carry the weight. We want closure. History does not provide it. Why did it happen? Historians have offered 100 explanations. Land disputes, gender politics, religious zealotry, mass hysteria, ergot poisoning, frontier anxieties. All of these are true. None of them is sufficient. The Salem witch trials happened because a perfect storm of factors, social, psychological, theological, economic, converged in a single place at a single moment. Remove any one factor, and maybe the trials do not happen, or maybe they happen differently, or maybe they happen somewhere else. We want a single cause because single causes are comprehensible. They give us something to fix, something to avoid. But history is not that simple. Atrocity is not that simple. The Salem witch trials happened because human beings are capable of cruelty when given the right conditions. Because fear is contagious. Because power corrupts. Because ideology can override empathy. These are not satisfying answers, but they are true, and they are still true today. The memorial in Salem lists 20 names, 20 people executed, but the list is incomplete. At least 5 more died in prison. Dorcas Good was psychologically destroyed. Countless others, the survivors, the families, the descendants, carried the trauma for the rest of their lives. But the memorial lists 20 names, and that is what we have. Names carved in stone, a promise that they will not be forgotten. Stand at the memorial on a cold morning, run your fingers over the letters. Bridget Bishop, Rebecca Nurse, Giles Corey, say their names aloud. Let your voice break the silence. This is what we owe the dead. Not justice. Justice is impossible. Not restitution. Restitution is meaningless. But memory. The promise that what happened to them will not be erased, that their suffering will not be minimized, that their names will endure. The Salem witch trials ended in 1693. But the reckoning has never ended. It continues in every courtroom, every accusation, every moral panic. It continues in the question we must ask ourselves again and again. Who are we hunting? Who are we condemning and why? The dead cannot answer, but they can watch, and they do. From the stone, from the archives, from the unmarked graves beneath the parking lots. They are still here, still waiting, still asking us to do better, and we owe them an answer.